Howdy, everybody. Welcome back to The Collective. We have an awesome show, awesome panel set up here for you. So I'm going to do a little round table so everybody can know who is who in the zoo. And we'll start on the one side of my screen and then we'll work myself over. So, Brian, give me a little quick bio on yourself and who you are, where you come from, why you're.
Yeah, sure. Happy to be here and appreciate the opportunity. I'm out west, so I'm out here in Delta, BC. For those that don't know it, Surrey, right next to it. Really good place to visit. Great Indian food. Joined the CAF in 1994. A lot of people do the Queen and Country speech. I wanted to shoot guns and watch things blow up. That's why I joined.
I joined
Well, yeah, right. I mean, and that's the truth of it. Spent 19 years in, vast majority of that working in reserve units or attached to regular force units at the time, and worked overseas in counter ID cell in Afghanistan, a couple of tours before that in Bosnia, and then went back as a NATO instructor. Since then, did a bit of advocacy for veterans. It's kind of the hair club for men thing, right? Like I'm a client as well as being part of the mix here. And so I started doing some work, some advocacy, and now I am the veteran advisor at Atlas, and fortunate to meet all of you and fortunate to have an opportunity to work with our folks at McMaster.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. Dr. Lynn Turksrow, please tell us about yourself, where you come from, and your field of expertise.
I come from Dundas, Ontario, next to Hamilton. I'm sorry I didn't have a label or like a handle after my name. I feel really kind of
I can fill one in for you if you'd
like. Me too. You like. I am a speech language pathologist by training. I'm the head of the speech pathology program at McMaster, and I've worked my whole professional life in the United States. So I started working with the U.S. Department of Defense and VA in 2003 because they did not know what to do with thousands of people with brain injury. So brain injury is my special area of expertise.
Awesome.
And happy to be here.
Thanks for coming. This is awesome. And Dr. Jackie Bosch, give us a little rundown.
Okay, no more doctor after this. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Lynn was born in Dundas, but Lynn left us. I am in Hamilton, McMaster University, along with Lynn. Here, this person who says she's Canadian comes up from the U.S. We're all like, I'm not so sure. And she starts talking about this intervention she has for people with traumatic brain injury. I'm an occupational therapist. I head up the OT program here, and it looked really exciting and interesting. And that's when we put together the proposal we're going to talk to you a bit about today. Thanks for having us.
Our absolute pleasure. And I mean, those that don't know Seb should already know Seb, but he's our Monday regular, always coming in, giving us words of advice and awesome wisdom. And then Shaun, everybody should know you, I think. But he's been on here every day for the last 4 months, almost 4 months. That's pretty crazy. So before we get anywhere, I do want to remind everybody, make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell. That way you can get notified every time we have one of these awesome conversations, which is every day. So you get to be in on it. The first thing I wanted to ask is, before we go too far into anything, is what is the proposal? What is the treatment? Like, give us a kind of an overview as to what it is you guys are doing right now. Let's go. Lynn, you want to start it off?
Sure. So we, just to give you a little history. So in the US for the last 3 years or so, we have been running a study of cognitive rehab for service members and veterans with mild traumatic brain injury who are having challenges in their everyday thinking. And when I moved back a few years ago, I was really passionate about doing something similar in Canada. So very fortunate to have reached out to the Atlas Foundation, Atlas Institute for Veterans and Families. Sorry about that, Brian. It's right there. And received this funding for us to try this this type of intervention for Canadian veterans of the armed forces and the RCMP. So it's basically rehabilitation that's focused on learning some strategies to help people be successful in their everyday thinking.
Awesome. Brian, would you give us a rundown on what you got?
Yeah, so for me, my criteria is a little bit different. My immediate person I work to is a research specialist, and he has a research team under him. They handle worrying about who are leaders in this space. You know, I bring an issue to them. It's their job to figure out, okay, you're going to work with McGill on that. That one's going to McMaster. I won't say I don't care about that, but that's his job. I want to make sure these people care about vets first, right? That's my litmus test. We have an opening discussion, and I find that there's people working in the community, and these are two of them, that care about making the life of veterans and their families better. That's my decision point. And that's where we got a while ago. It was like, okay, so they actually want to improve outcomes, right? Not just a file gets another file next to it, but potentially you're living better because of something that happened. And that potential's here. That's why I'm jazzed about it. Other than that, I tell you, I have an inbox as well, right? And it's got junk mail in it. I don't open everything in there, but we want people to open this.
For sure. Now, let's set the stage here, as Shaun always likes to say. Can we get a proper definition of what a TBI is, how it affects the brain, the body, that kind of stuff, and the differences between maybe the major versus the minor TBIs, and some possible, what's the word for it, causes of it, so that everybody is on the same page? Who wants to take it? Lynn, Jackie, Brian, anybody?
Lynn?
I could take it, Jackie.
His ideas on
it. Jackie, in our collaboration, Jackie is the expert in how to do a research study where you're trying something clinically. That's her. She's just genius at that, has tons of experience for years of research studies in stroke. So I'm the brain injury person, I think, of our duo, maybe. I don't know, that doesn't sound very good. Yeah, I'm definitely a SME. I've been a SME a lot over the last 20 years, so I'm used to being a SME. And I'll be Snow Goose, Brian, if you want to call me Snow Goose. That's totally fine. So traumatic brain injury is an injury to the brain from applied force. So that can be either direct hit to the head, but it can also be shaking the body. It can be a pressure wave where there's no physical contact with the brain or the body. And that affects connections of cells within the brain. Related to that, people can have a loss of oxygen that damages the brain. This is especially true for blast injury, where people were having, lung injury and things like that. So, but we're mostly talking about force. It ranges from the mildest to, very severe. So on the severe end is kind of what everybody knows. People are in a coma. They maybe have to have brain surgery. When they come out of it, they may have like real physical impairments that you can see. The other end, the milder end, has been more difficult, I think, for people to get their arms around. So the mildest end of brain injury is when you have a transient interruption in your neurological function, so in brain function. So some people don't have to lose consciousness. So you can feel kind of foggy or nauseated, get a bad headache, feel dizzy. That's what people call concussion. Concussion is synonymous with mild traumatic brain injury. So we're talking about, for most of the injuries, at least in the US, and from what I'm hearing here as well, it's on the milder end. And some of those injuries can be cumulative. So people can have, now in sports, they're talking about these repeated subconcussive blows where you have like multiple jars, like a jarring injury where you like hit the ground out of a jump, I'm learning from Brian, or off a boat or something like that, and it sort of rattles your cage a little bit, and so you can have an accumulation of those over time. So that's the full spectrum. So for us, we're mostly concerned at the mild end, because those are people who are not really getting therapy. They're kind of living with the consequences, and most people who have those injuries will be fine, but about 10% of people will have long-lasting effects from them.
No doubt. I think, Shaun and Seb, you have some experience having major hits like that. Do you want to give us a little background on some of your maybe stories between you guys for
Yeah, sure.
taking these hits?
Happy to do it. I was kind of explaining a little bit about my limited understanding of TBI in my live chat just before I came over to this, and in order to establish my end user experience with TBI, I just rattled off a few things. And so, as I understand it or understood it, it is a result of either kinetic energy or we'll call it a blunt trauma, so a concussive effect, either directly or indirectly across time space. And I faced those things, of course, within tier 1 or pre-tier 1. So as the examples that I was using, in a parachute jump, I hit so hard that I passed out. I went unconscious. I've been in multiple vehicle accidents. I have been blown up. I have been around lots of concussive forces in very tight spaces. One of the funny stories, funny, not funny stories, is I was responsible to secure the 50 cal sniper rifle package for Canada, brought it up and started cracking 50 cal sniper rounds downrange, not keeping a track of how many and how long. I just kept cranking. And then one day I thought, wow, my tooth is really bothering me. I should go see the dentist. And he said, hey, I don't know what's been going on, but how do you feel about an emergency root canal? We're going to have to extract that tooth. What have you been doing? Oh, nothing. And so I've had many experiences where I didn't know TBI was a thing. In fact, it was only just recently within the last year that I learned, just by happenstance, that the Canadian military now caps out or limits the amount of 50 cal rounds that you can push down range on a per weekly basis. Well, that rule didn't exist when we were first starting off, henceforth the dental surgery. And so the idea being that when I was in, TBI wasn't even a word. And so what my hope is, irrespective of whatever TBI damage I have or don't have, that your protocol, Lynn and Jackie and Brian, does not require me to do a whole bunch of burpees each day. Please tell me it doesn't require burpees.
There's not a burpee in the bunch.
Okay, no burpees. We're good to go. We can keep the conversation rolling.
Yeah.
That would have been like a non-starter, right? Like
That's
right
a
now,
non-starter
drop the
right now. In
mic
fact, we
moment.
would have just ended the podcast right here.
Yeah, right there.
On a burpee.
There's
Too many burpees.
There's
Go ahead, Brian.
a couple things there that, first of all, don't like the burpees. I also don't like running. Let's be fair. It's like
Let's be
I was just here.
Already done
Why
enough.
am I here again? So when we talk about, I see the name up there, Snow Goose. That's fantastic. And what you don't realize is you don't get any say in the nicknames, right? Like, and the
Fact.
responsibility now is actually on Jackie to ensure that name lives on.
100%.
I will take that gladly. Yeah, it's been spread already.
It's
I
not
really
about
hate
it's not
Canada
about
geese.
it's not about us doing our best for the collective right now. It's about us doing our best so that we don't get a bad nickname. I mean, that's why you have to be on your best behavior.
Dr. Burpee would be bad. Got
Too
it.
late.
Dr.
So-
Burpee.
Sean, you made a couple points there I want to have a go at. You said pre-tier 1, in other words, getting there. I think that's so important for us to realize. You also mentioned, nothing happened, or you kind of register that in your brain. And I think that's the thing here. You step on a mine, you're part of an IED strike, the world around you, including you, knows that a catastrophic event happened. But how about when you shot 50, 84 rounds in a week, right? How about breaking up the bar fights, Seb? How about that? How about all that kind of stuff? And I think that's what one of the themes of my work in TBI is going to be and continues to look at towards is like, I really hope we get out of this frame of mind that you had to be blown up to have something bad happen to your brain. And I really want people to start looking at their full experience, training, pugil stick fighting, beating each other up with big Q-tips to simulate bayonet fighting. That was my first time I was ever knocked out, and knocked out to the point I didn't know where I was. Having someone fall off a grizzly with a rifle in their hand, and they knocked it right on my orbital bone, and that knocked me out. Like, And I want people to realize those are the things that are part of this too.
You're right to raise that point, Brian, because specifically in my live chat this morning, I called out the Carl G, the 84, and the fact that the kinetic energy that thing dumps in a split second is so intense that if you don't have your mouth open, basically you just shoot snot straight onto your body armor. And I just called it the snotifying moment. That's where you learn the lesson, man. Mouth open, mouth closed.
Keep your mouth open, yeah.
That's right. And so that's all you get taught. Keep your mouth open, you dummy. But no one talks about the kinetic energy that you just absorbed every time you cranked around downrange. And so, again, to your point with the falling off the back of a Grizz or a Grizzly, an armored fighting vehicle, I called that out specifically in the sense of, doesn't matter what phase of your career you're in, if you're in the back of a LAV and you're warp factor 3 across really gnarly terrain, guess what? You're now a ping pong in the back of that thing and you're bouncing off of everything. Half of my time would be spent midair, like literally in a neutral state of anti-gravity, waiting to bounce off the next thing a split second later. And so there's many, many, many things that occur in respect to trauma or kinetic energy trauma that don't require big, sexy Hollywood moments of massive explosions in the background. They're literally happening every day if you're in a hard charging career.
Yeah, man. It's like hard landings in Hercs, right? When they're practicing landing on austere strips. You're looking at small boat teams slamming into waves and that pressure going all the way up, heels,
Those are
all
fun.
the way up to the spine. And where does it stop? The end point at the top. And there's all kinds of things like that I'm not privy to. I have watched some police training. That's about my experience with it. There's a lot of head trauma going on there. We've had folks come forward, Seb, that have said, they got back to their job, but they actually had a hard time testifying on the stand. And that's where they noticed the scramble effect, right? It's like, well, what the hell is that? And what's going on there?
So I did actually, Seb, you had mentioned earlier to me that you had some specific thoughts on, especially CQB and doing kill house and stuff like that. What you want to bring that up? And we can.
Yeah, absolutely. So I spent 12 years 16 years in the tactical space. So we, obviously everything that goes along with that, which is explosive forced entry, flashbangs, distraction devices, lots and lots of shooting, over and over in confined spaces, sometimes with cans or silencers or suppressors rather, and which also has a blowback. And of course the combatives, like everything we did in the combative space, everything we did in scenario-based training where the combatives was included. So, I mean, there is a ton of factors. I really like the fact that we sort of establish that it can be very insidious, because that's a metaphorically applicable segue to mental wellness or any other things. We're all waiting for the big things, and we're all thinking back, at the big things that could have affected us. And then sometimes it also leads to a comparison to somebody else. For example, well, this person had this, and I definitely probably don't have a TBI. This isn't serious enough, or whatever the case may be. So I really like the fact that we get a clarification about the compounding effect of receiving them over time. And I have a bit of a question, and I'm departing a little bit from this because I think it's relevant, because it's applicable. If we are looking, and there's been debates for years over this, if we are looking at the rules in boxing, for example, where the person gets hit and gets given a countdown and returns and gets hit again, and they need the 3 KO rule before their TKO, whereas in mixed martial arts, for example, once they get KO'd, it's over. Is there an actual, in the long term, and do we have a baseline? Is there an actual difference between those two?
Between a single blow and the multiple? It's physics, right? So it's how much force is applied to the brain. There was actually a researcher in the US who calculated how many amateur fights you had to have before you got what was called dementia pugilistica.
Okay.
Before it was called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, so CTE, right?
Wow.
So it was called dementia pugilistic, and it was called punch drunk syndrome, I think, before that. So I think that people know that cumulative, more than one is bad. I have only ever seen one study that compared multiple blows to a single blow, and that was not in boxing or like in MMA. It was in Detroit. So it was a study done in the emergency room. They compared being hit with a baseball bat to being hit with fists and feet, because the fists and feet were repetitive generally, and people generally got hit with a baseball bat once. It stuck out in my mind mostly because they had about 700 people in the study. I was like, that's a lot of patients in a year coming into the ER in Detroit. And the people who had the single blow had a worse injury initially, but the people with multiple cumulative blows had worse long-term consequences. Because there's really like not a lot of opportunity for the brain to heal in between. So, and I think that's been sort of the story with chronic traumatic encephalopathy as well. If you talk to the pathologist from the US Brain Bank in Boston, her comment is, it seems to be people who had multiple subconcussive blows or whatever within a short time is worse than having like one, and then you've got like 3 months of recovery and then you have another one.
So then when Shaun's there behind a Macmillan or a Barrett cracking out 50 cal rounds, isn't not doing it in the highest rate of fire, but one every couple of dozen seconds.
I'd be firing 2 or 3 per minute for sure.
Right.
And then it's the next day too, right? So it's not like you're doing that for 20 minutes and then
it's kind of like all day, and then I'll see you tomorrow.
And do it all over again.
I'll see you at the dentist.
Yeah, the dentist.
I'm amazed you didn't have other problems like, balance or just throwing up.
Oh,
it's arguable.
No, the best news is that when the dentist, and of course, by the way, we're a relatively new team. So I showed up with kind of shaggy hair and in civilian clothing and a pager on my belt, and he didn't know where I was from. I didn't even know our unit existed. And so when he said, here you go, I'm going to take that out, going to do this thing. And then when that was all done, he gave me some T3s and said, you'll need to take these right now because it's going to be really bad. I said, okay. So took the T3s and then went out the building, got in our unmarked Suburban and drove right back to our training facility, jumped straight back onto the firing line and started cranking rounds downrange again. And here's why. Because nobody knew any better.
Yeah.
And I was mission focused. I was on task.
Loving the reactions here, right? I've seen 3 people nodding, yeah, that's right. And then there's 2 sets of wide eyes as the people who actually know what's going on in our brains are having a
for sure.
A field trip.
Oh man. So Seb, do you have any other questions or anything to add to what we were just saying?
I had something that I would like to just throw out based on what Seb said, and it was contextualizing the experience. So, when you're, I'm going to talk about our military free fall parachutist course. It was the last course that jumped off of round parachutes, and the following year they shifted to square parachutes. And one of the reasons that they did that, the round parachutes, the opening shock on these things were so bad. So we spent an entire summer, about 50 jumps, getting qualified on these things. But every time you pulled your ripcord, this thing went off your back like a Claymore explosive device, like an explosion. A U.S. team got brought up to measure the opening shock, and they figured it was about 11 Gs. Now, the reason the team got brought up to measure that is because when we were opening shock, I had big field dressings on my leg where my leg harnesses were to stop the bleeding. The blood was going down into my boots on every jump because of the tearing or the kinetic motion of the parachute going off my back. My eyes were red. I didn't have any white in my eyes. All of us had blood-blowing eyes. The vessels in our eyes were blowing. And now I'm going to get to the point, the contextualization, as Seb was saying. So my eyes would be bloodshot and I'd be bleeding into my boots, but I'd look at the guy next to me and contextualize it against, well, at least my arm doesn't keep popping out of my shoulder every time I pull the chute, which was the guy that I'd have to go find after every jump to go put his arm back into his socket, because that was just what we did, because no one knew any better. And so the opening shock on these things was enough to call it brain rattling. And no one ever talked about that. But I'm sure that it wasn't good for our peanuts.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us, as far as repeated blows were concerned, if we're looking at such tactics such as hostage rescue, for example, where you have to be inside that room yesterday on account of evidently the hostage potentially getting harmed. So the explosive forced entry, you need to basically walk the fine line where you are far enough that you will be operationally effective, but also close enough that you can be inside that room on short order and dealing with whatever the threat is. And so it's a very fine line when you are training those tactics and doing multiple charges in a day and moving, and it's inexact science. Let's call a spade here. I mean, when you're looking at, are the windows open so we can, get some of the blowback out and do whatever. I mean, there's some calculation and there's a process to this, but there's also, a little bit of, okay, well, we should be good enough, and
This will work.
and operationally, there is no problem aside from the fact that you definitely don't want your team to enter the building rattled, to the point where they can't shoot, move, communicate effectively, or make the right decisions for that matter, or observations. And so a lot of our guys that were walking around with some issues eventually were mostly related to training events where repeated concussion. And it's very interesting because, and everybody here is familiar with the blast and how it works, but you can have 5 people in line and number 3 gets rattled and everybody else has nothing, depending where the blowback bounces. And so it's, again, very insidious, like, oh, I'm further behind, therefore the shock wave should be minimized. Well, it depends where it bounces off.
And also you, right? Also the person, in their physiology. So I know I have 2 brothers who box mostly each other. And one of them has a pretty scrawny neck and the other one doesn't. And so, like they have different outcomes. So, and one person could have their head turned a different way. Yeah. So you're right. It's funny, Seb, because people who work in X-ray, in radiology, they wear meters to say how much radiation exposure they have, but nobody's ever worn a force meter. Like now they've put them in NFL helmets experimentally, whatever. But in the military, nobody's ever said, oh, by the way, when your meter goes off, you've had too much force applied to your brain.
Yeah, let's put
what though, Lynn?
Yeah, the sensor. The sensor is called, you've got a huge dent in your helmet, go get a new one.
I do know at the engineering school, they put limits on it now. I think it's only, you're allowed 5 breaches in a day, where especially for the directing staff, they are just standing there, just kind of off to the side, waiting for that hit, and then bang, and you got 5 and you're done for the day. So the breaching portion actually has been extended because they can't get as many breaches in as they used to. So it's a tough one. Yeah, Brian?
And I think that's an important point there too, is Dr. Lynn was saying, well, measuring. I've been overseas with the dosimeter around my neck the entire time, 6 months, ordered to carry this thing to figure out how much radiation I'm exposed to. When you get a mortar issued to you, right? First thing that you do, obviously safety precaution, but when you do that, a book's going to fall out. And there's a little red duotang in there, and it's going to tell you things like how much blast that barrel has been exposed to, right? We are tracking damage to the metal, but not to you. And I note that, like Seb's describing a scenario here. He didn't say we're going to stop doing these things. Right, you're not right. Your buddies in uniform that are still there, Shaun. They're not going to stop jumping. He's not going to stop breaching. You're not going to stop having to do demos. It's not going to end, and that's one of the things you get. And I would say out of normal science, sometimes you'll get people coming to you and saying, "Well, don't do that then." Well, then our casualty count on deaths are going to go up because we're not prepared for really bad things. So we have to do these things. How do we do them? And then how do we handle people after that are affected?
Yeah. So let's dive into that. Jackie, can you walk us through what this protocol, how it's going to work, what it is people need to do to go through it?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Chance. So we've been working to create something that is meaningful, and we work with an advisory group of which you and Brian are both part. And the stories we've just heard, the recounts, the experiences are not dissimilar. And the difficult part when we thought of this study, Lynn said, look, we're going to get a ton of people people have a history of mild TBI who are veterans. And we said, great, we put it out there. And there was a little bit of interest, but then silence. And we realized we're not saying the right words to make people think, actually, it's you who would benefit from.
You just didn't clear up it wasn't burpees.
It wasn't burpees, exactly. And there's no running.
No burpee on
No
the line, Jackie,
burpees.
now that I'm
No running, no
thinking about
burpees.
it.
We're going to be changing that flyer. So, and the reason why this, I think this intervention is super exciting is because the whole premise is to say, okay, what do you have trouble doing in the day that you need to do with your cognition? No burpees, no running. And you start really from that premise. You know, we go through a list of items to say, are these the areas? Are these the areas? And determine what are the areas that need to be addressed. And then develop a plan to do so. 3 of those areas are worked on in a 3-week period, 3 times a week, about an hour long each session, to try to develop the strategies to address any of the functional deficits that people are seeing. And there's a chance to practice, re-practice, develop the program with the therapist that's working on the study, and basically work at the pace that's appropriate for the person. That's super exciting. But there's a second exciting part, and I really commend Atlas for taking a chance. Randomized controlled trials mean that when people come and offer to be a part of the trial, 50-50 chance, active or control. The control group gets education. And at the end of a 3-week period, we do the same assessment. People are going to say, and have said in the past, well, who would want to join? The only way to answer a question about whether an intervention is effective is to use a randomized controlled trial, or to take many, many, many years of observational data. We don't have many years. We need to determine the best treatments for veterans now. So it does mean that people signing up might not get the active treatment, but it also means that at the end of this study, we're going to know whether we can go forward with a much larger study to really prove whether this is effective. And that's the only way to get this implemented system-wide. I'm talking to people who know our government way better than I do. I only know the health end of things. And unless we walk in with the proof that it works, they're not going to change things drastically. But also, this is an opportunity. Any study at any time in any area of the world provides people with an opportunity to shed light on an area that maybe hadn't been talked enough about in the past. And so that's why we're really excited about this podcast, your involvement, allowing us to come on and discuss things with people, because we think this is an area that really needs far more attention. And yes, the trial will help us start to answer some questions, but really we also want people to start to realize how big a problem there really is.
Absolutely. Brian, you had a point?
Yeah, you know, one of the things I really liked about the study when we were first looking at it is it's not just here's a clipboard with a bunch of painful paperwork and we're just going to collect data. They're actually running people through the technique that they're speaking about. So people that are going to go through this, they'll actually be shown this technique. They'll actually have time to bounce it around and give it a go, right? And I think that's important. I also think that one thing I want people to know, this is completely anecdotal, but just amongst me and my peers, you know, the biggest time that CAF veterans are showing that, hey, there's something going on here, it's when they try and go and relearn or to try to learn something else. So voc rehab, you know, someone tells you, guess what, Burles, you're no longer going to be an engineer, but we're going to move you to this other trade. Now you're going to school. Or you're going through SISIP and VAC, and it's like, well, you're going to go be a safety inspector, what I wanted to do, right? And you get there and you can't read and you can't study and you just can't take those words off the page, put them in your head under pressure. But then you pick that up a day later when it doesn't matter, and I can read it just fine, right? Well, what's going on there? And that's one of the things, man. It's like people trying to get their life back in order, and they're trying to take that next step, and they're just having a hard time putting those words into their mind and then putting their thoughts out in words.
Yeah. Seb?
No, go ahead, ma'am.
Nope, go ahead, Seb.
Ma'am Snow Goose, you said.
I was just going to say, something amazing that just slipped my mind here.
Seriously.
and this
Good to
happens,
preface us.
and this might be as a result of multiple blast exposure.
Dude, how on point.
I was yeah, exactly. No, I was wanting to know what are some of the symptoms. Like if we were, and this is just I'm very curious about what are some of the things that people that are listening right now could be thinking. Well, this definitely is in the TBI, or this might be. What are some of the little insidious things that might be percolating in somebody's life that it would be that combined would lead them to perhaps want to look further into it?
So
Other than my almost non-existent long-term memory.
That would be one. Almost non-existent long-term memory would be one. So I can tell you from I think our U.S. service members and veterans are going to be reporting very similar things to here. So I can tell you now we have tons of knowledge about those everyday problems. There's a couple of things that I hope people think about. One is we hear a lot of people talking about having to have extra systems in place, extra reminders, there's a lot of my spouse is the one who has to organize my life. My kids are telling me I'm lost when we're driving. I forgot an activity that my kid was doing at school. Like there's a lot of family work. So I think if people are feeling like they're having to do a lot of work to keep track of their everyday remembering things and organizing things, that is definitely a sign. The other thing we hear a lot about is when someone has, it seems to be okay as long as nothing's going wrong in their life. So it's like, if I'm in my routine and I know what I'm doing 9 to 5 and everybody's on their best behavior, I'm okay. But if, again, I'm giving you examples from our participants, but it's like, well, now my kid's in trouble at school and my whole routine is screwed up. And now I can't concentrate. I'm behind on my email. And, sometimes there's this snowball effect that one thing changes and then all of a sudden all your routine's messed up and you're having trouble sort of thinking and getting organized. I think the one thing Brian said at our last meeting that really stuck with me was that there's a lot of veterans are living with this, and I think, Chance, you said the same thing. People are kind of they're coping. They're living with it and they're coping and don't think there's anything that could be better. So I think it's worth maybe taking a look at your everyday and saying, is everyone doing a lot of work here to keep all my crap together? And if so, can anything help me make that easier?
Yes, Seb?
Mitigate essentially, as opposed to try to eliminate, because we know it's probably not happening. So here's an interesting piece where things can, in my opinion, I'm sure we'll find out here. But if you have, say, a post-traumatic stress disorder or an occupational stress injury that's already in place, for example, and there are certain symptoms that are associated with this, it would be and could be foreseeably very easy to not realize that there's an actual physiological cause behind this, i.e. TBI, say, for example, in an anger management issues or whatever the case may be. And so if those things, and also inversely, it could be the other way around. So those are actually interconnected. And if you have been exposed to, the two causes, or you have a TBI and an occupational stress injury, you could be looking at something that's a lot more convoluted than we give it credit for as the end user, so to speak.
Seb, you could also be associating it with aging, right? And that's one of the things, one of my dogs just popped by. He's always wanted to have an internet cameo, so we just did that for him there. About a year and a half ago, I went through chemo, and there's a lot of pills with that. I could not manage it. My wife had to manage it. Without the pills beforehand, you can't do the chemo sessions. So the only way I got through that was by that happening, by my kids setting up reminders for me. That kind of stuff was the only management technique that works. Even at work these days, I tell people, if it matters, you have to call me, because I'll read the email, but it doesn't register as an event happened unless I have something like this that I can register. I think of it this way, you know, you're boiling 4 pots of water and you only got 3 lids, and you're constantly doing this to just keep track of it all. So we do find ways to do it, but what if there's an easier way?
Yeah. So let's think about that. Let's talk about, is there an easier way? What are some of the, can we discuss what the protocols are? Can we discuss like
Sure.
what the yeah? So what are we looking at? No
You worry
burpees
about-
first off, right? We're
So
just
like
to be very clear about that.
We want to keep this very mysterious so other people can't do it. I want to just come back to the burpees for a second. So while there are no burpees in the therapy, if, say, for example, you couldn't remember how many burpees you did every day and you had a goal of doing a certain number of burpees, we might come up with a strategy for you to log your burpees. So that might be. So a lot of the things people are working on is making effective use of, for example, their technology. So so sometimes a person will have like a calendar and then something on their phone, a couple of apps, and then their workplace has Outlook, and then their family is using something else. And we could work with that person to sort of unify all their devices and make the best use of their technology. One of my undergrad students did her thesis this year. She looked at comments about stress and burden on the family in the therapy sessions from the US. So we hear all the recordings of all the therapy sessions. And it was really interesting that a lot of people started with, well, my whatever partner has come up with a system, but I don't use it because I'm fine. And so sometimes the target is having a conversation with your partner to talk about how you could use that. And so it turns, you know, we could see this nice evolution through the treatment where by the end it's like, yes, we're using, family's got a family calendar and we're all using it now. So it could be something like that. It could be, we've had people develop like a script to say when they're overloaded. That's been like a therapy target. We've had people, we had a person who had a hearing loss, and as a result, the hearing loss plus the busyness of the environment made them withdraw completely. So we had that person kind of negotiate. They did a whole script for negotiating with their family. It's like, I don't hate you, I just can't think when it's this noisy. So it's not rocket science. It's just that when you're in your life, I think sometimes it's hard to take a step back and think about what would help. And also that's kind of what OTs, occupational therapists, and speech language pathologists are good at.
That's what I was just going to say, Lynn, that, you know, we take what you've done where you're having the trouble. Sometimes people just avoid it completely as well. So I think the interesting part about learning, reading, people don't want to do it. And there's lots of ways to get around reading nowadays, but developing that system, the strategy to start practicing again, getting a little more comfortable and getting a little confidence back is huge in moving things forward. But you don't often push yourself in a direction where you feel that you failed. So a little bit of support to go back to where you didn't want to go with some strategies in place to increase the likelihood of success is key to this intervention.
Right. And it also could be, sorry, I want to get to your question, Brian, about women and men's brain. Sorry, Chance.
No, by all means, I was just going to ask it for him.
Oh, yeah. So, and it also can be something really simple, like figuring out what time of day is best to have a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like sometimes people don't think, maybe I shouldn't be talking about something really important at 6:30 when I'm hungry and stressed. Or maybe I should write it down. This is never, Brian, when we did your podcast, that the family member, I don't know if I can say, well, she's on the podcast. I guess Larissa said it on the podcast. I made this comment that, you know, sometimes people can't hold a bunch of stuff in their mind at once. And so if your spouse says, go and do X, Y, and Z, maybe you only remember X. And I said, you know, that I always find that amazing because you really, why don't you just write it down so they don't have to remember it? And Larissa was like, oh.
that happens to me all the time. My wife will tell me multiple things to do throughout the day, and I will sometimes remember the last one or possibly the first one, but not usually the middle one. I'm not in there, right?
Yeah, you know, I get this weird thing with certain events that happen to me. I can tell you what socks the guy across from me in the lab was wearing. I can tell you this event happened. That guy was on leave. He normally sits there, so he was over that way a little bit. Useless details, completely pointless to my life, but they're there. Brain's full of them. And I've dropped the wrong kid off at the wrong school before.
Yeah. Luckily, both my kids go to the same school, so I don't have that issue.
See, now that's a strategy we could work on in therapy, getting both of your kids to go to the same school.
But Lynn, men's brains, but let's talk first about aging, because I thought you brought up a really important point, Brian, where everyone thinks, oh, I'm getting older. That's just usual. No, it's not always usual. I thought we could roll that into the difference between men and women.
Yeah.
So
the age,
is there a major difference on all of those?
So well, first let's tackle the men and women thing. Again, because it's physics. So women tend to have less muscular necks. So the same force applied, like the same IED explosion in my experience in the US, if a man and a woman standing there, a woman will probably have more damage to her brain because she has, as we say, like the popsicle stick neck. I'm sure you've heard that, or like bobbleheaded doll. So that's a difference. Interestingly, there are more in the world of people with milder cognitive problems who get therapy, there are more women. But it's not clear whether women are feeling better about going in for therapy or whether they're really affected more. So there certainly are, if you get to more severe injuries, there are definitely big differences. There are hormonally mediated differences between men and women. There are all kinds of biological differences. But at the mild end, I think it's a bit harder to know if it's a sex difference or it's a body type difference. The aging thing. Oh, sorry, Chance.
No, go ahead. By all means, go carry on.
I was just going to say, it's not normal to lose your memory when you get older. That's actually not normal aging. So normal aging is to be a little bit slower and a little bit less inhibited. But you should be able to do exactly the same things you could do before, only it takes you longer.
Potentially. And you might not even lose it, right? Like you
don't. No, you might not even lose it. Yep. No, you don't.
So
I assume if you take measures or countermeasures to prevent this, I mean, we know there's brain exercises, we know there's memory exercises and things, and so it's just a muscle like any other muscle, correct?
Sadly, incorrect. So that's why we're doing the intervention focused on strategies, because so far there's no evidence that those sort of mental exercises do anything for people in everyday life. So people generally get better at the games. And they may feel better, but we think that probably if it does generalize to your life, it's probably because doing the exercise taught you a strategy. Yeah. So like, for example, you might realize, oh, I have to pay attention to the periphery. So this is something that people, as they get older, sometimes they stop paying as much attention to the peripheral world. So you might realize, oh yeah, I should look around. So you take the idea of looking around out into the world. It's not that you got to look around muscle that got worked out.
That makes a ton of sense. I'd like to take this a little bit further, since let's clarify some of this stuff that we're going around that are being proliferated that we don't, necessarily, that are myths really, that haven't been, research corroborated. How about the fact that the brain obviously has neuroplasticity, which if somebody was to do certain things, there is something that can lead to neurogenesis where there's new wiring of the brain. So that is not being discounted, but also it's not necessarily a direct correlation. Is that what we're saying?
Yes. So of course the brain is plastic. Thank goodness, or there'd be no point in this podcast right? Or anything. So of course, there hasn't been evidence so far that the new neurons you get do anything meaningful for you. I mean, like you get new neurons in the hippocampus, but do they connect up in meaningful ways that really improve your function? Who knows? Maybe they do. I think right now we don't know that. But the bigger issue is that in your everyday life, that plasticity, it seems to happen sort of in context, if that makes sense. It's like all the rich things that mean something to you, and that, that's really what supports plasticity. If at Walter Reed, they had a room where all the service members with mild brain injury would come back, and they'd go in this room and do computer games, and people were like crying and vomiting and having really bad headaches and couldn't take the screen time. And so, like, is that good? Just doesn't seem good.
And
It sounds counterproductive.
That brings something to mind based on a conversation that I had about just over 3 weeks ago with some old friends. And we were talking about how they're still extremely sensitive to going into an indoor range like in the CQB and firing weapons, the overpressure. They're so ultra sensitive to it now that it's just been a corrosive impact over the decades. And so I was curious, as we were talking about it again just over 3 weeks ago, we're trying to guess if that will ever get better or if it's just a continuous degradation. Have you any idea on that?
I guess it depends on the cause. So if that's anxiety, you know what I mean? Like if that's, it could be the person's response to the stimulus, or it could be actually the nervous system's response to the stimulus, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, in this case, it was several decades of multiple exposures to overpressure in an internal environment.
Yeah. I don't know.
Well, is there anything like any studies or research being done into like whether it's degenerative? Like if you have multiple exposures in a row and then stop, is it going to degenerate from there, or is it going to hold that, or can you get better?
I think when it comes to cognitive function, that's the whole CTE research, right? It seems to like trigger a process that's actually a degenerative process. So that seems, if you look at these brains over time, that clearly something has started, something has been set in motion. And I know there are people who are still like CTE deniers, but it seems at this point, it seems pretty clear that something happens. So it starts, like CTE starts around parts of the brain where there's different density of tissue. So you see it like kind of around blood vessels. It's not like dementia that you see in, you know, in certain parts of the brain. It's actually around places you would think are related to force applied to the brain, where the brain's like blood vessels and brain tissue are moving at a different force. But once it starts, it spreads. So it's like the, you know, neurons depend on each other. Seb, you were saying neuroplasticity. So neurons depend on each other for growth factors and other things. So if one bunch of neurons in the brain dies off, it affects the next, you know, neurons next to them. So that's definitely a degenerative process. The sensitivity, Shaun, that you were talking about, that's the thing that I'm not really sure about. I just don't know that. I don't know that research, sorry.
Yeah, and I mean, it was just a handful of guys all standing facing each other, shrugging our shoulders and saying, geez, I hope it gets better. But
it's always a good way to look at a long-term injury. Yeah, should be good. We're almost out of time here, but quick little wrap ups here. Any final thoughts? Anything on either TBIs or, you know, some more symptoms or anything that somebody could glean from the last little bit, Brian?
Yeah, I'm happy to use the opportunity to wrap up. And my parting shot is this. You know, I really hope the veteran community can get out of this idea that you had to be blown up to have this problem. I really hope people start looking at the entirety of their career, what's happened, blunt force, blast, all of it, overpressure. You know, I think back to the first time someone threw a thunder flash, really just looked to me like, you know, an elevated firecracker. And I remember the next time a T-flash went off next to me in a concrete room, different experience, right? And all these things add up over time. We need to get better as a whole at looking at this as a likely reality for a lot of vets. You know, we've got to get past this thing of like 9-10 years into your therapy, someone starts to ask you about your brain. We really got to start looking at these things a lot sooner.
Absolutely. Yes, Ed?
Yeah, if I may, that's the perfect time to inject on this. I was going to say this, like the holistic approach to it, rather than being responsive or reactive, rather, kind of the same with mental wellness initiatives. You know, like how do you front load the work? And so we've spoken about a variety of different things, but I was curious, like evidently we've already spoken about the neck muscles being stronger. So therefore, there are things in the physical realm that can be done to help. What are some of those things? What are some of those things that can be done preemptively before you even engage in a career like that?
It sounds like there's been some motion toward that already with limiting exposure. I think from what Brian has said, having a helmet that fits would probably be good.
Are there things that can be addressed through training? Because what I don't like is to rely on external factors, because the external factors I cannot control. But are there things that I can personally do as an end user prior to engaging in a job like this to make myself less vulnerable to TBI?
So I think the unfortunate thing about TBI is it is an external force. I mean, by definition. So you're sort of up against your own anatomy and physiology in a way. I think the thing that people can do to really take charge, I mean, obviously being healthy and engaged and keeping your brain healthy and engaged, is really good. But, participating in life, that's good for aging. It's good for everything. But I also think for people to just be their own advocates and, early, and not wait until you've had like 50 blast exposures before you say something. So I think being mindful of your own brain health from early on, making sure you sleep, making sure you eat properly and you exercise, but also being an advocate for times when you feel like there's blast exposure or some kind of brain injury that people aren't talking about. And Chance, if I could say, like, if I could have one wrap up thing too to follow.
Absolutely.
Brian.
I was going to go through the whole, everybody was going to get a shot. So don't.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, by all means. So if you want
to. No, Goose will take it. I think that what I hope is, I'm appreciating the military mentality, like I've been around this for a couple of decades now, and I understand that you need to be tough, and that you need to kind of tough it out, and that admitting to cognitive challenges is not in the DNA of most people who are veterans. And I hope people can see the possibility for things to be easier, the possibility for things to be better. And it's not a bad thing, like it's not sexy, like a computer game where we can just, or pills or something like that can like cure the problem. It's work. It's just like counseling and PTSD treatment is work, but it is possible to be better.
I like that. That's what we do here every day. We look for ways to be better. So that's awesome. Jackie, any final thoughts? Anything you want to bring up? And also, how would anybody get involved in the actual study itself?
Oh, well, Chance, that's a beautiful way to end. We can give details about how to do that. I'm not sure how on this podcast to do so. We've got information available that you've been putting out through social media, and others have as well. You might actually have a better handle on where exactly it would all be found right now than we do.
Yeah. I can put all the links and stuff up. That's not a problem. I was just wondering, like, if somebody is just hearing about this, do they email McMaster? Do they talk to where is their point of contact?
There's an email, talklab@mcmaster.ca. They send that through, and either Lynn, myself, or the study coordinator will be in touch about next steps. And the important part is, and I hope this whole discussion was predicated on, let's say you don't know for sure, but you've heard things where you think, yeah, that kind of is the experience I had in life. Contact us. We'll have the discussion, talk it through. If you're not sure, it's worth the email if you're willing to take a little bit of time, and we can work through that.
That's awesome. Sid, any final thoughts?
No, well, aside from thank you very much for being here, enlightening us, and certainly bringing the brains to the operation today. It was much needed, and it was very, very valuable, and hopefully everybody gets something solid out of that, and I'm sure they will.
Yeah. Sean, anything? You got last thoughts?
Yeah, just the silver lining in the story, as it were, is I'll hit on the 3 points that have been touched on. Traumatic brain injury, I probably have some. PTSD, I definitely have been diagnosed with it. And age, I turned 60 this year. Is that 3 strikes you're out, Sean? So my point in saying all of that is to make this statement. There's definitely ways to manage it, and there's definitely ways to improve. Now, that doesn't mean that my TBI or whatever, any injuries that I picked up in the service, it doesn't mean that they all just got wiped away just because I'm trying extra hard. I just try hard every day. I try to do my best every day. And whether I'm setting timers on my phone or whether I'm putting something on a calendar or whatever, I've just found ways to manage. I've never, ever stopped trying to find ways. And that's an important message, I think, certainly from my perspective, is the relentless pursuit of excellence. And that means for my brain as well. So this conversation has been fantastic for me. I've learned quite a few things. And the last point I'll make is this, Jackie, please put me down on your list for engagement in the process so that I can help in any way that I can.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Outstanding. And with that, we're actually just our hour, which is perfect. But I just want to thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate being able to pass this information out there. I know there were lots of people watching. There weren't many people commenting, but I think everyone was just so engaged by the conversation. I really wanted to say thank you guys. It has been awesome. And as we learn about traumatic brain injuries and we grow ourselves better, we can build better for the future. And we do that every day here. So we'll see you all tomorrow. Chimo.
Chimo.
Chimo.